If you've been waiting to take care of your vehicle service or buy new tires, the Tires Plus Epic Sales Event is here. Between June 6th and 9th, save up to $100 when you spend $600 or more. Schedule your appointment at tiresplus.com.
Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Aliana Kernodle. A federal judge ruled last week that New Hampshire laws limiting classroom discussion around critical race theory and divisive topics are unconstitutionally vague and violate the 14th Amendment. Joining me to tell us more about this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, we've mentioned restrictions on divisive topics on the show before, but could you go over kind of what these restrictions are, particularly as it relates to New Hampshire?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, there's actually like a number of states have passed these kinds of divisive content laws, or they're sometimes framed as like critical race theory bans or like legislation that would prevent, divisive topics in the classroom. This, depending on who is talking about it or like what framing they're using, it could be any number of those things. So that's essentially the sort of the background. And this started back when former President Donald Trump was in office. He signed an executive order with this kind of language in it. So like banning critical race theory, essentially. And that essentially was overturned when current President Joe Biden entered office. That was overturned. And then a lot of states started passing legislation that had a lot of that same language. So that's sort of the background. And New Hampshire was one of those states. And basically the New Hampshire law, it essentially has like four concepts that it prohibits public, primary, secondary school students from learning about. So basically it's like there are these like core concepts. And usually these are like, that students can't be taught that one race is inherently inferior or superior to another. Right. And so what it's trying to target is like this idea that critics of critical race theory kind of say is like, it's basically trying to instill like an oppressed versus an oppressor sort of mindset, or that, somebody is, inferior or superior, right? So that you have like that sort of dynamic there of like oppressor and oppressee kind of thing. And so that's what it's trying to target.
And can you lay out the case for us in New Hampshire? Who brought it and what were their claims?
Yeah, so it was like a wide, variety of plaintiffs, using some of the legal language there from the document, the case, right? And so it was like some teachers unions, the ACLU, and essentially they brought it on behalf of, and I think there's a couple of other like groups or individuals there, but they essentially brought it on behalf of teachers. And they said, look, like teachers, they don't have any clarity regarding like what can they teach, because these laws are very broad, right? They describe a lot of different kinds of things related to race. And so, teachers are wondering like, if I do this, is it going to get me fired? Is it going to get me in trouble? And kind of related to that, like about what constitutes like violating a teacher's right to free speech, right? Do you have the ability to talk about what you want to talk about in the classroom? So essentially, they're looking at this and they're saying we should have the ability to talk about these different kinds of issues in class. And so it's like a concern over, the teaching profession, essentially. Like if you've, and I've talked to teachers who've said, it's kind of like you're walking around on eggshells. Like, do I talk about this? Do I get into, this? If you're in a state that has this divisive topic law, can you get into like certain parts of history? And like, do you dodge around, some of those topics that maybe aren't divisive in themselves, but like maybe relate to some of these like kinds of questions, right?
Yeah. And just speaking from my own experience in the classroom, it can be hard to balance all of those factors of, even without a law like this, you're trying to decide, well, like, what are the kids going to be able to understand at the age that they're at? What's going to be a way of approaching this that's going to lead to a like fruitful conversation where we can actually, come to a better understanding of our history. And it's just all around a difficult situation. So then what did the judge rule on this, and what were kind of his reasons?
Yeah, absolutely. So the federal judge, Paul Barbadoro, I hope I'm saying that right, he basically said, look, these plaintiffs, the unions and advocates for teachers who have challenged the law, they're right. And that the broad language of the statutes means that teachers could be prohibited from merely discussing ideas that fit within the banned concepts. So like that's a direct quote from the opinion. And, that in quote, like, the banned concepts speak only obliquely about the speech that they target, and in doing so, fail to provide teachers with much needed clarity as to how the amendments apply to the very topics that they were meant to address. So basically, the judge was saying, like, there's not a lot of definition in the law, and that the lawmakers who wrote the law, they were trying to target some of these ideas, but they didn't expressly delineate those ideas. And so instead of saying, like, we're targeting critical race theory, they kind of said, like, we're targeting the idea that one person is inferior or superior to another, right? And so then the federal judge said, quote, teachers are thus left in the untenable position of having to wager their careers on a guess, or else refrain from discussing matters that implicate the banned concepts altogether. So either you go out there and you say, I'm going to teach this anyway because I think it's important, but then you're like wagering, like you're basically saying, like, I'm going to bet my career on it, that I'm right. Or you don't talk about it. And so then, the risk there is that students are getting this huge disservice because of this is pretty overbroad. So in no uncertain terms, the judge said this was vague and violated the U.S. Constitution. So the 14th Amendment, the Constitution, the judge said. So
I know this is kind of speculation, but what sorts of wider impacts could this decision have?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because so much I've written about these divisive topic laws and these different kinds of content moderation laws, like sort of governing what teachers in public schools can talk about in classrooms. And a lot of them have that same wording, and a lot of that is borrowed from that Trump executive order. So they you had Republicans in these legislatures taking these and saying, we're going to run with it. And so it has like a lot of that like inferior, superior language, or like, teaching won't make students feel guilty because of their race or their national origin or whatever, like those kinds of things, which on their face, they sound kind of fine, but you start getting into them and you're like, okay, but what does that apply to? Right. So then I think that this does open up, some legal challenge opportunities for teachers in those states to say like, okay, this has worked in this federal court, and let's take it in our own state and apply it and say, like, let's challenge the laws there and say that. And I mean, these are, I think, are going on around the country. I mean, these laws are sometimes relatively new, right? 2021, 2022, we've seen a lot of those come through and take effect. And I think they have to take effect really before you can like show the courts that there's harm, and then the legal process takes a long time. So I'm not exactly sure how many of these are in the works in terms of lawsuits, but I do think that it opens up like a strong legal precedent that these kinds of laws can be unconstitutionally vague according to this logic and this reasoning. So I mean, I don't know all of the ins and outs because I'm not a lawyer, but I do think that it does open up, some questions about what the future of some of these laws in different states is going to look like.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insight on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Some people would call him a loser. He ran for state office. He was beaten. He started a business. He failed. He ran for Congress. He lost. He was nominated for vice president. He lost again. But he knew only those who never tried are the real losers. And Abraham Lincoln was no loser. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
If you've been waiting to take care of your vehicle service or buy new tires, the Tires Plus Epic Sales Event is here. Between June 6th and 9th, save up to $100 when you spend $600 or more. Schedule your appointment at tiresplus.com.